Jonah raised a baby shark from near death, forming a bond like no other, but when he ignored a warning to never meet the now massive shark in the wild, he was left stunned by what happened next. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Will love and trust be enough, or will nature's raw power take over? Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Jonah had always been drawn to the ocean. As a child, he spent countless hours sitting on the shore, watching the waves crash against the rocks, and dreaming of a life where he could dive into the deep blue and connect with the creatures that lived beneath the surface. He would often find himself fascinated by the stories his grandfather told him about the sea, tales of monstrous whales, elusive dolphins, and the occasional encounter with a shark. As he grew older, Jonah's passion for marine life became all-consuming, and it wasn't long before he decided to pursue a career working with marine animals. What he didn't know was that this passion would soon lead him into a situation he had never anticipated, one that would challenge his understanding of nature, trust, and the true power of the ocean. One summer afternoon, while working as a volunteer at a local marine rescue center, Jonah encountered a situation that would forever change the course of his life. The center had received a call about a baby shark that had been found stranded along the shore. The shark was small, no bigger than a human child, but it was clearly in distress. It had suffered a deep wound on its side, likely from an accidental encounter with a boat propeller or some other form of human interference. Jonah's heart sank as he saw the poor creature, its small body weak and struggling to breathe. It wasn't the first time he had seen an injured shark, but something about this one struck a chord with him. He knew that if they didn't act quickly, the shark would not survive. The rescue team worked fast, taking the shark to the facility where it could receive medical treatment. But after a few days, it became clear that the baby shark wasn't going to make it unless something drastic changed. Despite the care of the veterinarians, it seemed to be getting weaker by the hour. The staff debated euthanasia as the most humane option, but Jonah couldn't bear to let the shark die. He couldn't shake the image of its helplessness, lying there in that tank, slowly fading away. He made a decision. He would take the shark home, care for it himself, and try to nurse it back to health. He knew it was a risky move, but he felt an undeniable sense of responsibility for the creature. Jonah had always been an animal lover, and the idea of raising a baby shark, one of the ocean's most feared predators, was both thrilling and terrifying. He had heard countless stories of shark attacks, of the dangers these creatures posed, and yet, something about this baby shark called to him. It was helpless, it was alone, and Jonah felt a deep desire to help it. When he brought the shark home, he set up a large saltwater tank in his backyard, the closest thing he could create to its natural habitat. Every day, Jonah spent hours tending to the shark, whom he affectionately named Finn. He fed it fish, kept the water temperature just right, and made sure to give it plenty of space to swim. As the days went by, Finn began to improve. His wounds healed, his body grew stronger, and Jonah felt an overwhelming sense of pride. What surprised Jonah most was the bond that formed between him and Finn. He had expected the shark to remain wary of him, as wild animals often do. But as the weeks turned into months, Finn became increasingly comfortable around Jonah. He would swim up to the edge of the tank, circling it slowly, almost as if inspecting his caregiver. Jonah would sit by the tank, watching Finn's graceful movements and marveling at the intelligence in his dark, glossy eyes. It was an experience unlike anything Jonah had ever had before. Finn wasn't just a shark, he was a creature Jonah had rescued and nurtured. He felt responsible for Finn's well-being, and over time, that responsibility turned into a deep emotional connection. But as much as Jonah cherished the bond they had, he also began to realize that this connection might not be as safe as he once believed. Dr. Thornton, a seasoned marine biologist who had been advising Jonah throughout the process, had cautioned him from the beginning. "Sharks are not pets, Jonah," she had told him in the early days. "No matter how much you care for them, they are still wild animals. The instincts that make them the apex predators of the sea can't be tamed. You have to be careful." At first, Jonah dismissed Dr. Thornton's warnings. He believed that his bond with Finn was different. After all, he had raised him from a fragile baby. He had watched him grow, nurtured him back to health, and spent countless hours with him. Surely, Finn wasn't like the other sharks. He was special. He trusted Jonah, and Jonah trusted him. As time passed, however, Jonah began to notice subtle changes in Finn's behavior. The playful swishes of his tail had become more forceful, his movements more aggressive. What was once a gentle creature had begun to show signs of dominance, circling Jonah with a new intensity that sent a chill down his spine. There were moments when Finn would stare at Jonah, his dark eyes fixed on him with an unnerving focus. Jonah tried to convince himself that it was nothing, just a phase, perhaps. After all, Finn was growing larger every day. He was becoming a powerful creature, and with power came instincts that could be unpredictable. But deep down, Jonah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had shifted. One evening, as Jonah fed Finn, Dr. Thornton called. Her voice was urgent, almost frantic. "Jonah," she said, "I need you to listen to me. You've raised Finn, but you've also unknowingly created a dangerous situation. Sharks, especially ones raised in captivity, can become unpredictable as they mature. They might trust you, but their natural instincts will always be stronger. I'm begging you, Jonah, do not attempt to swim with him in the wild. It could be catastrophic for both of you." Jonah, however, was confident that Finn was different. He had raised Finn, after all, and their bond was unbreakable. "I know Finn," Jonah replied, his voice firm. "He's not like other sharks. I've raised him, and he trusts me." Dr. Thornton was quiet for a moment before speaking again, her voice softer but still filled with warning. "Please, Jonah, I know you care for him, but you can't control nature. Finn is a wild animal, and no matter what you feel for him, he will always be driven by instincts that you can't predict. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can safely control a creature like that. Trust me." Jonah hung up the phone, but the words stayed with him. Still, the stubbornness that had led him to save Finn in the first place kept him from fully accepting Dr. Thornton's warnings. Finn had been gentle with him before. Why wouldn't he be now? He dismissed the growing sense of unease in his stomach. After all, how could something that had become such a huge part of his life suddenly become a threat? But as Finn grew larger and more powerful, Jonah could no longer ignore the warnings. The shark had become unpredictable, and Jonah knew it was only a matter of time before the bond they shared would be tested. The question wasn't whether Finn would change, it was when. And Jonah had no idea that the day he chose to confront the very danger he had been warned about would change everything. It was a decision Jonah would regret forever, and one that would force him to face the harsh reality of what it meant to raise a creature like Finn, a creature that, despite all of his love and care, could never truly be tamed. Jonah had always dreamed of a life deeply connected with the ocean. Growing up by the coast, his childhood was filled with sun-drenched afternoons spent watching the waves crash against the shore, the scent of salt water in the air, and the rhythmic sounds of the tides. From a young age, he felt an unexplainable bond with the sea, its creatures, and everything that lived beneath its surface. For as long as he could remember, Jonah had wanted to dedicate his life to marine biology, to study and protect the creatures that lived in the world's vast oceans. He wasn't just fascinated by the mysteries of the deep, he felt a deep calling to preserve the delicate ecosystems and vulnerable species that inhabited them. The ocean, with all its beauty and danger, represented freedom to Jonah, an untamed force that needed understanding, respect, and protection. However, his path to a fulfilling career in marine biology wasn't a straight one. His family, while supportive, didn't understand his obsession with the sea. His father, a lawyer, wanted Jonah to follow in his footsteps, to take over the family firm one day, to wear suits, attend meetings, and earn a stable income. But Jonah knew that a life spent behind a desk wasn't for him. He tried, for a while, to conform to what was expected of him, taking summer internships in law firms and following through with his father's vision. But the spark inside him only grew stronger until he couldn't deny it anymore. He needed the ocean. He needed to be immersed in it. It wasn't just a career choice, it was his calling. At the age of 23, after graduating from college with a degree in marine biology, Jonah found himself standing on the shores of a small coastal town in Northern California, a place he had once visited on a family vacation and had never stopped dreaming about. He had moved here to work with a small marine rescue center that specialized in rehabilitating injured sea life and returning them to their natural habitats. The center, located just a few miles from the water's edge, was a modest facility, but Jonah had never been happier. The work was challenging, and the hours were long, but every day brought new opportunities to make a difference. Jonah felt more alive than he ever had, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. It was during his second week at the center that Jonah's life took an unexpected turn. A call came in from a nearby fishing boat that had spotted a baby shark stranded in their nets, severely injured and on the verge of death. The team at the center had a few specialists on hand who were skilled in shark rehabilitation, but nothing could prepare Jonah for the sight of the shark when it arrived. The baby shark was no larger than a small dog, its body bruised and battered from the struggle with the nets. Its gills were barely moving, and its once glossy scales had become dull from the trauma. It was clear that this little creature was in desperate need of help, but Jonah couldn't help but feel a deep sorrow for the shark. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. It was a powerful creature, but in this moment, it was vulnerable, fragile, and lost. Jonah immediately volunteered to help with the shark's recovery, and he was entrusted with its care. He named the shark Finn, after the first time he'd seen its dorsal fin poking above the water when it was initially brought to the center. He began by cleaning the shark's wounds, treating its injuries, and feeding it a specialized diet designed to help rebuild its strength. Over the weeks, Jonah became more and more invested in Finn's recovery. There was something about this shark that resonated with him deeply. It wasn't just the challenge of rehabilitating such a powerful creature, it was the responsibility of saving a life that Jonah took so personally. The bond between the two grew stronger each day. Finn would follow Jonah's movements around the small pool where he was being kept, his sharp eyes always watching, always alert. Jonah would talk to him, sometimes even singing softly to him, as if trying to calm the shark's restless energy. He was amazed by how quickly Finn adapted to the environment and responded to Jonah's care. As Finn recovered, Jonah started to see the shark in a different light. No longer was Finn the broken creature he had once been. He was growing, thriving, and becoming something powerful in his own right. Jonah marveled at the way the shark moved through the water, with a natural grace and speed that he could never have imagined when he first laid eyes on him. Finn had become more than just a project. He had become a friend, a companion, and a symbol of Jonah's dedication to his work. Jonah was proud of the progress Finn had made, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before Finn would be ready to return to the ocean where he belonged. But as Finn grew, so did the challenges. Jonah noticed that the baby shark he had once nurtured and cared for was becoming more unpredictable. At first, Finn had been curious but cautious around Jonah, but as he grew stronger, he started to exhibit behaviors that made Jonah uneasy. There were moments when Finn would swim erratically, bumping against the sides of the tank with a force that made Jonah flinch. Other times, Finn would glare at Jonah with eyes that seemed to be filled with a deep, wild intelligence, eyes that were no longer the innocent, trusting eyes of the baby shark Jonah had rescued. Jonah couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease every time he swam with Finn. It was as if the shark was starting to sense his own power, and Jonah was beginning to wonder if he had underestimated how dangerous Finn could become. Jonah had been warned by the center's staff about the unpredictable nature of sharks raised in captivity. While many sharks could adapt to life in the wild after rehabilitation, there was always the risk that they would develop aggressive tendencies if they weren't allowed to roam free. Jonah had always been aware of the potential risks, but he had never expected it to happen with Finn. He had grown so attached to the shark, so emotionally invested in his recovery, that the idea of Finn becoming dangerous seemed almost impossible to him. But as Finn's behavior became more erratic, Jonah began to realize that the shark he had raised was not the same creature he had first rescued. One day, After Finn had swum furiously around the pool for hours, Jonah received a call from Dr. Thornton, a renowned marine biologist who had been advising him on Finn's recovery. Dr. Thornton had been following the progress of Finn's rehabilitation closely, and she had seen the signs of the shark's growing aggression. "Jonah," she said firmly, "I've been following Finn's recovery, and I need to warn you, this is no longer the same shark you saved. He's not a pet, and he's not a domesticated animal. You can't continue to treat him like one. When a shark grows to his size, their instincts take over. They become unpredictable, and you risk putting yourself in grave danger if you try to continue swimming with him." Jonah listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew she was right, but he didn't want to accept it. He had invested so much time and energy into raising Finn, into building this bond. The thought of losing Finn, of having to give him up to the wild, felt like a betrayal. "I know, Dr. Thornton," Jonah replied quietly, "but I can't just let him go. He's not just a shark to me. He's like family." Dr. Thornton's tone softened. "I understand, Jonah. But you need to remember that family doesn't always mean safety. Finn is wild, and you can't change that. Please, for your own safety, don't try to meet him in the wild. You're risking more than you realize." Jonah promised Dr. Thornton he would be cautious, but deep down, he was torn. He couldn't ignore the warnings, but he also couldn't bring himself to abandon the shark who had become such an important part of his life. What he didn't realize at the time was that ignoring those warnings would lead him down a path that he could never have predicted, one where his bond with Finn would be tested in ways he couldn't have imagined. Jonah had spent the last several months caring for Finn, and in that time, their bond had grown stronger than anything he had ever known. But with each passing day, a quiet sense of unease began to settle in his chest. There were moments when Finn's behavior, once gentle and playful, became more unpredictable. At first, Jonah brushed it off. He told himself that sharks, like any other creature, had their moods, their periods of adjustment. After all, Finn was growing rapidly, and with that growth came new instincts, new drives, things Jonah was only beginning to understand. He had never expected Finn to remain the same forever. But deep down, Jonah knew something was changing. It was something he could feel in the air when he swam with Finn, an unspoken tension that seemed to echo through the water. The more Jonah thought about it, the more he began to question whether he was truly prepared for what was to come. He had been warned, after all. Dr. Thornton had been a mentor of sorts during the early stages of Jonah's project. A respected marine biologist, she had seen more than her fair share of sharks and had worked with various species in both captivity and the wild. Her warnings had come from years of experience and research, but Jonah had dismissed them as unnecessary precautions. "He's different," Jonah had told himself over and over again. Finn wasn't like other sharks. He was gentle, affectionate, and, despite his growing size, he was still the baby shark Jonah had saved. Surely that bond meant something. Surely he could trust Finn. But the truth Jonah had refused to see was that no matter how much he loved Finn, Finn was still a shark. And sharks were wild animals, creatures shaped by instincts that Jonah could never fully control. It was late one evening when Jonah received the call that made him stop everything and finally listen. He was in the backyard, watching Finn swim in the large, purpose-built tank Jonah had created for him. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the water's surface. Finn had been swimming in tight circles, his behavior erratic. Jonah knew something was off, but still, he convinced himself it was just a phase. The baby shark was growing, and perhaps the changes in his temperament were a normal part of the process. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Jonah glanced at the screen and saw the name Dr. Thornton flash before him. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks. She had been away on a research expedition, and Jonah had kept her updated on Finn's progress. But now, with Finn's recent behavior weighing on his mind, Jonah wasn't sure he was ready to hear what she had to say. He hesitated for a moment, then swiped to answer. "Jonah," Dr. Thornton's voice was calm but firm, "we need to talk about Finn." The words hit Jonah like a punch to the gut. His stomach twisted with a mixture of anxiety and guilt. "What's wrong?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've been going over the reports you sent me," she said, her tone unwavering. "And I have to tell you, I'm concerned. The bond you think you have with Finn, it's not enough to change his nature. He's a wild animal, Jonah. You can't treat him like a pet. The shark he's becoming isn't the same one you brought home. And the more he grows, the more unpredictable he will get." Jonah shook his head, disbelieving. "But I've raised him from a baby. He trusts me. He's not like the others. You should see the way he responds to me. He's gentle, Dr. Thornton. He's different." "I understand that you believe that," she replied, her voice softening. "But the reality is, no matter how much you care for him, no matter how much he's grown to trust you, there are instincts deep within him that you can't control. They will always be there, Jonah. They are hardwired into his being. And those instincts will come to the surface when you least expect it. That's why I'm warning you. Do not swim with him in the open water. Do not get in the tank with him once he's fully grown. It could be dangerous, for both you and Finn." Jonah felt a lump form in his throat. He had known, deep down, that there were risks. But he had never imagined this. He had never imagined that the bond they had formed might not be enough to save them both. It felt as though the very foundation of his trust in Finn was being called into question. He didn't want to believe it. The thought of losing Finn, of pushing him away after all they had been through, was almost unbearable. The idea that Finn, the shark he had saved, could suddenly become a threat to him was unimaginable. "I raised him. I've done everything for him," Jonah's voice faltered. "He's part of my family. I can't just turn away from him now. I won't." "I'm not saying you should turn away from him, Jonah," Dr. Thornton said, her voice firm but kind. "But you need to be realistic. No matter how much you love him, Finn will never be fully tamed. It's not safe for you, and it's not safe for him. He needs to be free, not confined by your need to protect him. The wild is where he belongs." There was a long pause on the line as Jonah absorbed her words. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but a part of him knew she was right. Everything she said made sense, and yet he felt a deep pang of guilt. Could he really let go of Finn, the creature he had poured so much of himself into? Could he really acknowledge that the shark he had nurtured and loved was never meant to be domesticated, no matter how much he wished otherwise? "I know this is hard to hear," Dr. Thornton continued. "But you need to trust me on this. The longer you ignore the reality of Finn's nature, the more dangerous it becomes. Please promise me you won't swim with him in open water again." Jonah stood still, his gaze locked on Finn, who was now circling the perimeter of the tank, his movements swift and sleek. There was no denying it anymore, Dr. Thornton was right. Finn had changed. He was no longer the helpless baby shark that Jonah had saved. He was becoming something else, something powerful and unpredictable. And Jonah was not prepared to face that. I'll think about what you've said," Jonah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, Jonah," Dr. Thornton said softly, "for your own safety, and Finn's, don't ignore this warning." As Jonah ended the call, a heavy weight settled over him. The excitement and pride he had once felt for raising Finn were now replaced with a deep, nagging fear. Fear for Finn's future, for his own safety, and for the bond they had shared. He stood motionless, staring at the water, unable to tear his eyes away from the shark who had once been so small and innocent. Now, he was something else, something Jonah could no longer fully understand. The next few days were a blur. Jonah couldn't shake the warning from his mind, nor could he escape the unsettling feeling that had begun to settle in his chest. Every time he swam with Finn, a part of him wondered if it would be the last time. Every playful nudge from the shark seemed laced with an underlying tension that Jonah couldn't ignore. And yet, despite all the warnings, Jonah couldn't bring himself to take that final step back. He couldn't accept that Finn, his Finn, might one day become a threat. The idea was too heartbreaking to entertain. But deep down, Jonah knew Dr. Thornton's words weren't just cautionary, they were prophetic. The reality of Finn's transformation was becoming impossible to deny. Jonah stood at the edge of the water, watching Finn swim in the tank, and for the first time, he wondered if he had already crossed a line he couldn't return from. As Finn continued to grow, Jonah found himself grappling with an ever-deepening sense of unease. The baby shark he had so lovingly cared for had transformed before his eyes into a force of nature. Finn's sleek, silver-gray body had stretched to nearly 10 feet long, and his once innocent playfulness had given way to moments of aggression that Jonah couldn't ignore. Jonah had spent countless hours swimming with Finn, teaching him tricks, even coaxing him into a calm, near-domesticated state. But now, there were signs that things weren't the same. Finn no longer looked at Jonah with the same gentle curiosity. His movements were faster, more unpredictable. Jonah had started noticing subtle changes in the shark's behavior, ones that sent a cold shiver down his spine. At first, it was just small things, the way Finn circled him more tightly, his eyes narrowing suspiciously when Jonah swam close. It wasn't the playful gaze of a young shark, but something darker, something primal. There were also times when Finn, who had always been responsive to Jonah's commands, would simply ignore him or swim away in what seemed like defiance. These shifts didn't happen every day, but they occurred enough for Jonah to begin questioning if he truly understood the shark as well as he had once believed. Jonah tried to rationalize it. After all, Finn was no longer the small, vulnerable creature he had rescued. The baby shark was becoming an apex predator, and maybe that was just a natural part of the process. He tried to convince himself that the occasional bursts of aggression weren't personal, that Finn was simply acting on his instincts. But deep down, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't just Finn's behavior that had changed. Jonah's own perspective on their relationship had begun to shift as well. What once felt like a pure, unconditional bond now had moments of doubt. He found himself second-guessing his actions, asking himself whether he had gone too far in bringing a wild animal into his life. Perhaps he had created a false sense of safety, an illusion that he truly controlled the situation. He thought back to Dr. Thornton's warning. Sharks, especially ones raised in captivity, can react unpredictably, she had said. Jonah had dismissed it at first, believing that Finn was different. But now, those words echoed in his mind. Jonah tried to push the thought away, but it was hard to ignore the growing uncertainty that gnawed at him. The more Jonah reflected on Finn's behavior, the more he began to wonder if he had unintentionally caused these changes. After all, he had raised Finn in a human-made environment. He had kept him in a tank that, no matter how large, was still confined. While Jonah had worked hard to replicate the ocean's conditions, there was no substitute for the wild. Finn had never known true freedom, never swum with other sharks or hunted prey in open waters. In Jonah's attempts to protect Finn, had he inadvertently stunted the shark's natural instincts? Was Finn's aggression a response to the frustration of being confined, a signal that the shark was growing restless and desperate for something more? Jonah was torn. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. On one hand, he couldn't deny the growing disconnect between them. On the other hand, he had always believed that love and care could overcome any challenge, that the bond between him and Finn could defy the limitations of nature. Jonah found himself questioning everything. Had he underestimated the true nature of the wild, assuming that Finn could remain a domesticated creature forever? Or was this just part of the shark's natural growth, a phase that all creatures go through? He spent more time with Finn, trying to reconnect, but the more he tried, the more Finn seemed distant, colder, and unpredictable. Jonah began to notice a disturbing pattern. When he tried to coax Finn into calmer waters, the shark would push back. When Jonah attempted to swim beside him, Finn would dart away, his movements sharp and erratic. The bond they once shared now felt tenuous, like a thread hanging by a mere strand. And it wasn't just Finn. Jonah began to question his own motivations. Had he been too selfish in his desire to keep Finn close? The shark was meant to be wild, not a pet. Jonah's love for Finn had clouded his judgment. He had raised him with the hope of proving that humans and nature could coexist in harmony, but the reality was far more complicated. The shark had grown into an animal driven by instinct, not affection, and Jonah was only now realizing how little control he truly had over the situation. As the days went by, Jonah's concern deepened. His friends and family noticed his growing anxiety. They could see the toll that Finn's behavior was taking on him, but Jonah refused to listen. He brushed off their concerns, insisting that everything was fine, that Finn just needed more time to adjust. But the truth was that Jonah was scared. Scared of what Finn might do if he pushed too hard. Scared of what would happen if he truly lost the bond they shared. One afternoon, Jonah stood by the edge of his pool, watching Finn swim circles beneath the surface. The water shimmered in the late afternoon light, casting ripples that danced across the concrete. Finn's dorsal fin cut through the water like a blade, swift and silent. Jonah's heart clenched in his chest. He had raised this shark from a baby, but now, as Finn swam with an air of indifference, Jonah could feel the distance between them widening. The playful moments they had shared seemed like a distant memory, and the harsh reality of their situation loomed larger than ever. Jonah's mind raced with conflicting emotions. He had spent so much time and energy nurturing Finn, yet now he was unsure whether the shark even recognized him as a friend anymore. The once unshakable confidence Jonah had in their relationship was now replaced with doubt and fear. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Finn, of seeing the animal he had raised turn into something that could no longer be controlled. Yet, deep down, Jonah knew that his attempts to shield Finn from the wild were only delaying the inevitable. No matter how hard he tried to keep Finn safe, the shark was growing into a force of nature, one that no amount of love or care could tame. The uncertainty continued to plague Jonah's thoughts. Could he continue to care for Finn in the same way he had before? Or was he setting himself up for something far worse? The days grew longer, and Jonah felt increasingly trapped between his desire to protect Finn and the growing realization that he was out of his depth. He wasn't just keeping a shark anymore, he was keeping a creature that belonged in the open ocean, a creature that, no matter how much he loved it, would never truly be his to control. Jonah spent countless sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment he had shared with Finn. The joy, the pride, the hope, all of it seemed so distant now, replaced with a gnawing sense of loss. The bond he had cherished so much was fraying at the edges, and Jonah didn't know if he could fix it. Was it too late? Had he already crossed a line that couldn't be undone? The uncertainty hung over him like a dark cloud, and Jonah realized, with a heavy heart, that there might be no easy answers. And yet, despite the growing tension, Jonah couldn't bring himself to let go of Finn. He had raised this shark, cared for him, loved him. He couldn't imagine life without him. But the question remained, what would happen next? Jonah didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: the future was uncertain, and the only way forward was to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The uncertainty in Jonah's heart matched the uncertainty in Finn's movements, and both of them were now headed toward a collision that Jonah wasn't sure he was ready for. A year had passed since Jonah had first taken Finn into his care, and during those months, his bond with the shark had only deepened. He often marveled at how the tiny, fragile creature had transformed into a force of nature, sleek and powerful, gliding through the water with grace and precision. Every day, Jonah spent hours observing Finn as he swam in the specially designed, large tank Jonah had built. He had carefully engineered it to replicate the shark's natural environment, ensuring Finn had enough space to grow while remaining safe and contained. But even with all the precautions, Jonah knew that his time with Finn was running out. The baby shark was becoming a mature animal, and soon, the tank would no longer suffice. Jonah had done everything in his power to care for Finn, from making sure the water temperature was optimal to providing the right mix of nutrients in his diet. But as Finn grew, Jonah began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. The shark had always been playful, nudging Jonah with his snout and darting in and out of the water in a curious, almost affectionate manner. But now, Finn's movements were faster, more deliberate, and occasionally, more aggressive. There were days when Finn would approach the edge of the tank with a predatory gleam in his eyes, as though testing Jonah's strength, as if he could sense his growing power. Jonah had learned to read Finn's body language over the months, but this new, unpredictable behavior unsettled him. One evening, as Jonah was watching Finn swim laps in his tank, the phone rang. It was Dr. Thornton, the marine biologist who had been advising him from the start. She had warned Jonah early on about the dangers of raising a shark in captivity, but Jonah had always dismissed her concerns. He felt a sense of responsibility for Finn. He had saved him, raised him, and become a part of his life. He refused to believe that Finn would ever turn on him. But Dr. Thornton's voice on the other end of the line made Jonah's stomach churn with unease. "Jonah, I've been keeping up with your progress," Dr. Thornton began, her tone serious. "I've seen the pictures, I've heard about Finn's growth, and I need to warn you again. You need to stop. Sharks, especially ones raised in captivity, behave unpredictably as they mature. The bond you think you have with him, it's not enough. You cannot underestimate his instincts. He is still a wild animal." Jonah tried to reassure her, as he had done countless times before. "Dr. Thornton, I understand your concerns, but I know Finn. He's different. He trusts me. We have a connection that goes beyond just caretaker and animal. I can feel it." But Dr. Thornton wasn't convinced. "You're not understanding me, Jonah. I'm not saying he's going to hurt you out of malice, but his instincts will kick in. Sharks are solitary creatures, and in the wild, they don't form relationships like you think they do. Finn is still a predator, and you're asking for trouble if you push this any further." Jonah's heart raced as he listened to her words. He had always been stubborn, always felt that his bond with Finn was unbreakable. He couldn't accept the idea that Finn could hurt him, not after all they had been through together. But as the phone call ended, Jonah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, Dr. Thornton was right. Days passed, and the sense of foreboding lingered. Jonah began to notice the signs more clearly now. Finn was faster, stronger, and more unpredictable in the water. He would swim toward Jonah with a sudden burst of speed, forcing Jonah to step back in surprise. There was an undeniable shift in the shark's behavior. He was no longer the small, defenseless creature Jonah had nursed back to health. He was now a powerful predator, and Jonah was no longer certain of his place in Finn's world. Yet, despite all of this, Jonah found it nearly impossible to pull away from his deep connection with the shark. The idea of parting with Finn felt like a betrayal. Jonah had raised him from a helpless pup, and together they had overcome so much. He had been with Finn through every milestone, from the first time Finn swam on his own to the day he caught his first fish. They had shared countless moments together, moments Jonah believed were unique, forged through trust and love. The thought of ending that, of letting go of his shark, was unfathomable. And so, Jonah made a fateful decision. He would swim with Finn one last time, just the two of them. He would meet Finn in the wild, where the shark truly belonged, and see if the bond they shared would hold. It was risky, but Jonah's mind was made up. He needed to know, needed to prove to himself, that Finn still trusted him. After all, they had shared so much, and Jonah refused to believe that all of that could be undone in a moment. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jonah prepared for the swim. He stood at the edge of the large cove where he had often taken Finn to play, the waters now dark and inviting. The sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the ocean shimmered in the dying light. The air was still, almost eerily quiet. Jonah felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread as he slipped into the water, his heart racing. Finn was already there, circling him from a distance, his dark silhouette cutting through the water like a shadow. Jonah hesitated for a moment, but then he called out softly to Finn. "Come on, boy. Come to me." His voice was steady, but his pulse quickened as Finn swam toward him, faster than Jonah had ever seen him move before. The water around him seemed to churn with energy as the shark glided toward him, his massive body slicing through the ocean with ease. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. Finn was no longer the playful baby he had raised. He had transformed into a force of nature, a creature of raw power. Jonah reached out, extending his hand to Finn as the shark came within reach. For a moment, it seemed as though time stood still. Finn paused just inches from Jonah's outstretched fingers, and the two stared at each other, locked in an unspoken connection. Jonah felt the weight of the moment, the gravity of the bond they had shared. It was a moment of pure intimacy, a moment that was both beautiful and terrifying. But then, without warning, Finn darted away. Jonah blinked, disoriented. What had just happened? His shark had swum off, disappearing into the deeper waters of the cove. Jonah's heart raced as he swam after him, calling his name. Finn! Come back! Come on, buddy! But Finn didn't return. The shark was gone, swallowed by the vast ocean. Jonah felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. He had made a mistake. He had pushed too far, allowed himself to believe that the bond between them was unbreakable. Finn was a wild animal, and no amount of love or care could change that. As Jonah swam back toward the shore, he realized the truth. He had underestimated the raw power of nature and the instincts that still lay beneath the surface of the creature he had raised. That night, as Jonah sat on the beach, staring out at the dark waters, he felt a deep sense of loss. The connection he had once felt with Finn was now gone, replaced by a haunting awareness of his own fragility in the face of nature's unpredictability. He had done his best to protect Finn, but in the end, it was clear, some bonds could never be tamed, and some creatures were always meant to remain wild. Jonah had learned the hard way that no matter how deep the bond, there were limits to what could be controlled, and Finn, for all his strength and grace, was one of those limits. Jonah's feet sank into the cool, wet sand as he stepped into the water, the waves crashing rhythmically around him. The sun had begun its descent, casting an orange glow over the horizon, and the air felt thick with anticipation. He was alone, save for the vast stretch of ocean before him. His heart raced, a mixture of excitement and anxiety churning within him. Jonah had spent countless hours watching Finn from the shore, but today was different. Today, he was going to swim alongside him again, just like they had when Finn was still small, fragile, and innocent. With each step he took, the water crept higher up his legs, the briny scent of the ocean filling his nostrils. He could hear the soft lapping of the waves against his body, and yet all he could focus on was the shape moving just beneath the surface. Finn was out there, and the bond Jonah had forged with him, what felt like an unbreakable connection, pushed him forward despite the nagging warnings that echoed in his mind. Jonah's eyes darted over the water, searching for any sign of the shark. The once gentle creature he had raised from infancy now lived freely in the ocean, a powerful force of nature. He had heard that sharks could be unpredictable, even dangerous, but he couldn't shake the belief that Finn was different. Finn trusted him, Jonah reasoned. He had to. After everything they had been through, the idea that Finn could turn on him felt impossible. He had seen sharks in the wild, ferocious, untamable creatures, yes, but Finn was his. There was a bond between them that no one else could understand, not even Dr. Thornton, who had warned him time and time again. Jonah stood at the water's edge, wading deeper, feeling the cold chill of the ocean embrace him as the water reached his waist. His breath hitched, and he had to force himself to steady his heartbeat. He glanced over his shoulder one last time to make sure no one was around, to ensure this moment was private and just for him and Finn. The vastness of the ocean made him feel small, but in that moment, it also felt oddly comforting, like he was about to do something sacred. Jonah had often wondered if this was the moment Finn had been waiting for all along, the chance to swim together as equals. Jonah cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Finn." His voice echoed over the water, carried by the wind. For a moment, there was silence. No ripples. No movements. Then, as if answering his call, the water shifted. Finn's dorsal fin broke through the surface, cutting a sleek line across the otherwise calm sea. Jonah's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his chest. He had seen Finn do this many times before when he was young, his small fin cutting through the water like a tiny dagger. But now, the fin that surfaced was much larger, a clear sign that Finn had outgrown the small, innocent shark Jonah had raised. The shark circled slowly, just beyond Jonah's reach, its movements graceful and powerful. Jonah could see Finn's dark, glistening eyes glancing at him from below, watching, calculating. Jonah's hands trembled slightly as he tried to steady himself, recalling the countless hours spent swimming with Finn in his backyard pool, helping him grow stronger. But now, as he stood in the open ocean, he was confronted with something entirely different, a creature that no longer seemed to recognize him in the same way. "Come on, Finn. Come closer," Jonah whispered, half pleading, half commanding. He tried to remain calm, his voice steady, though inside, he was a storm of conflicting emotions. He wanted to believe that the connection they had was unbreakable, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. Finn had grown, and with that growth came danger. Finn's instincts, those primal urges that he could never have predicted or controlled, were now part of the creature he had raised. Finn hesitated, circling farther out, almost as though he was testing Jonah. The shark's movements were no longer playful, but deliberate, calculated. His sharp, predatory eyes never left Jonah, sizing him up. Jonah stood frozen in the water, his body tense, waiting for Finn to make the next move. The familiar sense of companionship he had felt with Finn began to fade, replaced by something more foreboding. The water felt colder now, and Jonah was acutely aware of his vulnerability. He could see the power in Finn's body, the raw muscle rippling under the surface, and he began to realize just how much he had underestimated the shark. "Come on, Finn," Jonah said again, his voice shaky now, as he stepped forward. But as he did, Finn darted away, cutting through the water with such speed that Jonah barely had time to react. For a moment, the water was still. Jonah's chest tightened. Where had Finn gone? His mind raced, recalling every moment spent with Finn, wondering if he could have missed the signs. Perhaps he had been too naive to think that the shark he raised would always be loyal, always be tame. Then, without warning, Finn surged from below, faster than Jonah had ever seen him move. The shark's massive body rose up from the depths, its teeth gleaming white in the fading light. Jonah gasped, a surge of panic flooding his system as he instinctively took a step back, but it was too late. Finn was right there, too close for comfort. Jonah froze, his body paralyzed with fear. In that moment, he saw it clearly. Finn was not the playful baby shark anymore. He was a force of nature, and nature didn't care about the bonds forged by humans. Finn stopped mere inches from Jonah, his massive body hovering just beneath the surface of the water. Jonah could feel the immense power radiating from the shark, its muscles rippling with tension. He knew he should swim away, but his body refused to move. He stood still, watching Finn's eyes. They were no longer filled with the curiosity and innocence Jonah remembered. Now, they were cold, calculating, predatory. The shark circled him once, slowly, and Jonah felt a rush of fear flood his chest. It was as though Finn was evaluating him, deciding whether Jonah was still worth the bond they once shared. Or, perhaps, Finn was simply reminding him of the natural order of things. Time seemed to stretch on, an eternity of fear and anticipation. Jonah could hear his breath coming in shallow gasps, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finn, still circling, paused directly in front of him, eyeing him closely. Jonah's thoughts scrambled. Was this it? Was Finn going to attack? Was the bond they shared truly gone, replaced by the primal instincts of a wild animal? Then, as quickly as he had appeared, Finn surged away, disappearing into the dark depths of the ocean. Jonah was left standing there, drenched, trembling, his chest tight with the realization that he had narrowly escaped disaster. His legs felt weak, and he could barely stand, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Jonah slowly turned and began to swim back toward the shore, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had Finn truly been close to attacking, or was it all just a misunderstanding? Was the bond he had thought was so strong completely shattered, or had Finn simply been testing him, reminding him of the power he had always held? When Jonah finally reached the shore, he collapsed onto the sand, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He looked out over the water, the waves now calm, almost too calm. The bond he had once felt with Finn felt so distant now, so fragile. Jonah had learned a hard lesson: nature could not be tamed, no matter how much love and care you poured into it. And no matter how much you believed in the creature you raised, nature would always have the final say. The ocean stretched out before him, vast and endless. Finn had gone back to the wild, and Jonah could only watch as his creation, his friend, disappeared into the depths once again. He had always known the ocean was unpredictable, but now he truly understood just how wild and untamable it could be. Jonah sat there on the shore, watching the horizon, a heavy weight on his heart. He had tried to be the hero. He had tried to save Finn, but in the end, it was nature, not him, that controlled the fate of the shark he once thought he knew. Jonah had learned, in the harshest of ways, that some creatures were meant to remain wild, untouched by human hands, and that sometimes, love alone couldn't protect you from the dangers of the natural world. The ocean was calm, yet Jonah's heart was anything but. Every sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to echo louder in his ears. He had swum alongside Finn countless times, never imagining this day would come, the day he would feel the weight of the ocean in a way he hadn't before, heavy, suffocating, unpredictable. What had started as an innocent decision, a moment of recklessness, was now turning into a nightmare Jonah hadn't seen coming. The bond between them was supposed to be unbreakable, yet the reality of it was so far from what he had imagined. Jonah's breath came in short gasps, every exhale mixing with the cold sea air as he stood in the shallows, staring out at the vast expanse of water ahead of him. Finn, the shark he had raised from a helpless pup, circled him slowly. His once small body had grown massive, and Jonah couldn't help but marvel at how the creature had changed over the course of the year. Finn's skin was now a deep gray, sleek and glistening under the sunlight as he glided effortlessly through the water. His sharp eyes, which once held a kind of childlike curiosity, now gleamed with a different intensity, something primal, something wild. The joy and innocence Jonah had once felt around Finn were now replaced by a growing sense of unease. The shark's behavior had started to shift weeks ago, but Jonah had refused to acknowledge it. He had told himself that Finn's bursts of aggression were just part of growing up, that they didn't signify anything dangerous. But deep down, he knew he had ignored the signs. Finn's actions were no longer playful, no longer the antics of a baby shark. Every time Jonah swam with him now, Finn seemed to move with more force, with more power. His tail would slap the water harder, his movements more erratic, his gaze colder. And Jonah had become so caught up in his feelings of attachment and his misplaced confidence that he had dismissed Dr. Thornton's warning. He had spent the last few days in deep contemplation. Something about Finn's recent behavior unsettled him, but he couldn't bring himself to admit what it was. Maybe he was just being paranoid, he thought. After all, this was the shark he had raised. He knew Finn better than anyone. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. But even as those thoughts reassured him, there was another voice, much quieter and far more rational, that told him to listen to the warnings. To let Finn go, to stop pretending that everything would remain safe just because they shared a history. But Jonah had never been one to back down. He had always believed that his bond with Finn was different from what anyone else could understand. He had saved Finn's life. He had raised him. Surely that bond meant something. Surely that bond would protect him. As Jonah took a step further into the water, his feet barely touching the sandy bottom, Finn came closer. The shark swam circles around him, moving faster now, as if sensing Jonah's hesitation. Jonah held his breath, feeling the tension in the air, the weight of the water pressing against his chest. He reached out to Finn, extending his hand in a futile attempt to calm the shark, but Finn only swam away, circling at a greater distance before returning. Jonah's pulse quickened, and his mind raced. Something was wrong. He could feel it now, deep in his bones. "Come on, Finn," Jonah muttered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. "It's okay. I'm not going anywhere." His voice sounded hollow, even to him. The words felt meaningless, a feeble attempt to reconnect with something he couldn't control anymore. Finn had changed. Jonah wasn't sure when it had happened, but he could no longer deny it. The playful, trusting creature that had once swum alongside him was gone. Finn's large dorsal fin sliced through the water, making sharp, rhythmic movements. Jonah's gaze followed the fin, but when it vanished beneath the surface, his anxiety soared. He could no longer see Finn, but he knew he was still there, circling just below, watching. Jonah held his breath, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. Then, without warning, Finn burst from the water, his massive body twisting in a graceful yet terrifying arc, his teeth gleaming as he lunged forward. Jonah's heart stopped. He could feel the immense power in Finn's leap, the raw strength of the predator now in front of him. Time seemed to slow as the shark's jaws snapped shut inches from Jonah's body. In that moment, Jonah's entire world shattered. It wasn't just the close call that rattled him, it was the realization that Finn wasn't the same animal anymore. He was a creature of the wild, driven by instincts Jonah could no longer control. For the first time, Jonah saw Finn as what he truly was, a predator. And in that moment, Jonah's own survival instinct kicked in. The water around him felt suddenly overwhelming. The weight of the ocean seemed to close in, swallowing him whole. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he frantically swam toward the shore, his muscles burning with the effort, his panic clouding his thoughts. Behind him, Finn continued to chase, his enormous body gliding through the water with terrifying speed. Jonah's arms and legs moved mechanically, the sharp sting of salt water in his mouth and eyes doing nothing to slow him down. His sole focus was the shore, getting to safety, to solid ground. Every stroke felt like it took him further from reality, as if he were in a dream where nothing was quite real, but everything was still happening. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Jonah felt the water beneath his feet shift. The ocean's waves, once furious and relentless, seemed to calm, as if acknowledging that the chase was over. He looked over his shoulder, expecting to see Finn closing in on him, but the shark had vanished. Jonah's breath came in ragged gasps as he slowly turned his head toward the shore. His feet finally found solid ground, and he stumbled out of the water, drenched and shaking. His knees buckled as he collapsed onto the sand, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. He gasped for air, staring out at the ocean, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finn had almost killed him. And what was worse, Jonah realized, was that it hadn't been an accident. Finn had come for him. Finn had intended to harm him. Jonah's thoughts swirled as he sat on the beach, the reality of the situation sinking in like a heavy weight. He had raised Finn, he had saved him, and in return, Finn had nearly taken his life. The bond that Jonah had been so certain would protect him had crumbled in the face of nature's raw, untamable force. His attachment to Finn, though real, had been built on an illusion, a misguided belief that love and care could change the very nature of the wild. As Jonah looked out at the horizon, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow for both himself and Finn. He had wanted to believe that Finn was more than just a shark, that somehow he could break through the instincts that were ingrained in the creature from the moment he was born. But the ocean had its own rules, and Jonah had learned too late that there was no changing them. Tears stung Jonah's eyes, though he didn't know whether they were from fear or regret. It didn't matter. What mattered now was the painful truth: Finn was no longer the baby shark he had raised. And Jonah, for all his love and good intentions, had lost something far more valuable than just a pet. He had lost his sense of control. The shark had grown into something wild, something Jonah could never tame. And the ocean had reminded him, harshly, of that fact. Jonah sat in silence, the weight of the ocean pressing on him, knowing that his journey with Finn had come to an end. Whether he had been naive or simply unwilling to face the truth earlier, it was now undeniable. Finn was a wild creature, and Jonah had been foolish enough to think that the bond between them could change that. Jonah sat on the warm, grainy sand, his body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and disbelief. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The water around him had seemed peaceful just moments ago, a vast, endless stretch of ocean that had once felt like home, like a refuge where he and Finn could coexist. But now, it felt like an alien world, one he no longer understood. He gazed out at the horizon, the waves gently lapping at the shore, as his mind replayed the events that had just unfolded, each second stretching into eternity. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Jonah had always believed that the bond he shared with Finn was unique, something unbreakable. After all, he had raised the shark from a defenseless pup, nursed it back to health, and spent countless hours swimming alongside it. There had been times when they played together in the shallow waters, Finn circling Jonah in a graceful, almost affectionate dance. Jonah had taught Finn to trust him, to feel safe under his care, and for so long, it had felt like they were connected on a deeper level than simply man and wild animal. Yet in the blink of an eye, that sense of trust had been shattered, as if it had never existed at all. When Finn had swum toward him, his movements had been swift and purposeful, unlike the playful nudges of the past. Jonah's heart had stopped for a moment, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in. This wasn't the shark he had raised. This was a wild creature, driven by instincts that Jonah, for all his affection and care, could not control. Finn's eyes, once filled with the innocence of a baby animal, had now turned cold and calculating. The connection they had shared seemed to vanish in that instant, replaced by the raw power of nature that Jonah could never tame. Jonah's mind raced with guilt and confusion. Had he made a mistake? Should he have listened to Dr. Thornton? She had warned him, time and time again, that sharks, even those raised in captivity, had an inherent wildness in them. No amount of care or familiarity could change that. But Jonah had refused to believe it. He had told himself that Finn was different, that their bond was stronger than the primal instincts of a predator. He had believed that love and patience could overcome the very essence of nature itself. Now, sitting in the sand, Jonah realized how wrong he had been. He looked down at his hands, still trembling from the encounter. His palms were slick with sweat, and he could feel the pulse of his heart in his fingertips. He had survived, but for what? The shock of narrowly escaping Finn's attack left him with a deep, gnawing sadness that he couldn't shake. He had always prided himself on his connection with animals, on his ability to empathize with them in ways that others couldn't. But this moment, had exposed a harsh truth. No matter how much love you give, some animals will always be wild, and some things can never be controlled. The waves continued to crash gently against the shore, but for Jonah, they no longer held the same calming sound they once had. They felt like a reminder of his failure, a constant echo in his mind. He had raised Finn, and in doing so, had become blinded by his own arrogance. He had assumed that his bond with Finn was special, that the shark would somehow transcend its instincts, but nature had a way of asserting itself, no matter how much human intervention was involved. And in that moment, Jonah realized that he had been fooling himself. Finn had never truly been his to control or keep. He had been the shark's guardian, but Finn was always meant to live in the wild, free and untamed. Jonah's thoughts turned to Dr. Thornton. She had been a guiding voice in his life, a seasoned marine biologist who had spent years studying sharks and their behavior. She had warned him countless times about the dangers of trying to domesticate or humanize a wild animal. Jonah had respected her wisdom, but somewhere along the way, he had allowed his emotions to cloud his judgment. He had seen Finn not as a wild creature, but as a pet, something to be cared for, nurtured, and protected. And in doing so, he had failed to recognize the true nature of the animal before him. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the images of Finn's sudden, intense movements in the water. The shark had been so fast, so powerful, and Jonah had been so vulnerable. His heart had pounded in his chest, a reminder of the thin line between safety and danger in the world of wildlife. For all his efforts to domesticate Finn, the shark had never truly been tame. It had only been waiting for the right moment to remind Jonah of the untamed force it truly was. A wave of sadness washed over Jonah as he thought about the life Finn would live from here on out. He had always imagined that Finn would eventually be released back into the wild, where he could swim freely and thrive. But Jonah had never truly accepted the full reality of that moment, the moment when Finn would no longer need him. Jonah had raised Finn to be a part of the natural world, but in doing so, he had overlooked the fact that Finn's true home was out there, beyond the safety of the shore, in the deep, unpredictable waters of the ocean. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him fully. He had failed Finn. He had tried to protect him, to keep him close, but in doing so, he had stunted the shark's growth, emotionally and physically. Finn had outgrown the small space Jonah had provided for him, and the shark had outgrown Jonah's capacity to care for him. It was as though, in trying to make Finn dependent on him, Jonah had only done Finn a disservice. Finn needed the ocean, not Jonah. He needed freedom, not captivity. Jonah had been so focused on his own sense of pride and responsibility that he had failed to see what Finn truly needed. Tears welled in Jonah's eyes, a mixture of guilt, sorrow, and helplessness. He had raised Finn with the best intentions, but intentions alone were not enough when it came to nature. Finn had outgrown his need for Jonah, and in that moment, Jonah knew that he had to let go. It was the only way to honor the shark he had once loved. He could no longer keep Finn in a small, controlled environment. The ocean was calling to him, and Jonah's role was to ensure Finn's freedom, even if it meant letting go of the bond they had shared. Jonah stood up, wiping his eyes and taking a deep, steadying breath. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the water. It was a beautiful, peaceful sight, but it felt different now, as though it held a lesson Jonah was only beginning to understand. He had tried to play God with Finn, trying to protect him from the dangers of the wild, but in doing so, he had denied Finn the life he was meant to live. With a heavy heart, Jonah walked toward the edge of the water, where he had first met Finn all those months ago. He felt a deep sense of loss, but also a quiet understanding. Finn had taught him something important, something he would never forget. There were some things in life that simply couldn't be controlled. And as much as Jonah had tried to protect Finn, the shark had always belonged to the ocean, not to him. Jonah stopped at the water's edge and looked out at the ocean one last time. The waves continued to roll in, relentless and free, just like the shark he had raised. And in that moment, Jonah knew that he had made the right decision, even if it had come too late. Finn was no longer his responsibility. He was free. Jonah turned and walked away, leaving the ocean behind, knowing that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go. Jonah spent the following weeks in a haze of reflection, replaying the events with Finn over and over in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shark swimming toward him with that fierce intensity. He could still feel the surge of panic as the predator's body cut through the water, its power and speed something he could never truly match. Despite the relief of surviving, Jonah's mind was burdened with guilt, his pride shattered by the realization that he had failed to understand the true nature of the animal he had tried so hard to protect. For days, Jonah avoided the beach, afraid of the waves and what they might bring. But the ocean, as always, called to him. It was a strange paradox. This vast, unpredictable expanse of water had once felt like a home, a place where he could control his destiny. Yet now, it felt foreign, almost like an enemy. He had misjudged the ocean and the creatures within it, and the cost of that mistake weighed heavily on his heart. It wasn't just Finn's attack that haunted Jonah, it was the realization that he had been selfish. He had cared for Finn, yes, but he had done so for himself as much as for the shark. He had sought to tame Finn, to make the wild animal something he could keep, something he could call his own. In doing so, he had disregarded the shark's needs and natural instincts. Jonah had raised Finn to survive, but in that process, he had imposed his own desires onto the shark's life, refusing to acknowledge that Finn was never meant to be a pet or a captive animal. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. He was a creature of the ocean, born to roam freely, not confined to a tank or a controlled environment. It was this realization that finally broke Jonah's silence. Sitting alone in his small cabin overlooking the sea, he wrote a letter to Dr. Thornton, the marine biologist who had warned him all along about the dangers of his approach. Jonah felt a deep sense of shame as he wrote, but also gratitude for the wisdom she had shared with him. He thanked her for her patience and guidance, even though he had failed to heed her warnings. He poured his heart into the letter, confessing his mistakes and the lessons he had learned too late. The letter was a small act of atonement, an acknowledgement that he had been wrong, but also a recognition that change was possible, even if it came at a high cost. After sending the letter, Jonah found himself walking along the beach every morning, staring out at the ocean. He thought about Finn, about what the shark's life would look like now. Jonah had spent so much time imagining Finn's future, but he had always envisioned it within the confines of his control, within the walls of the tank he had built. Now, Jonah understood that Finn's future lay in the open water, not in a small, man-made space. He had made the mistake of thinking that the shark's survival depended on him, when in reality, the ocean had always been Finn's true home. The wild was where Finn belonged. Jonah began to volunteer at the rescue center again, but this time with a different perspective. He still had the same love for the ocean and its creatures, but he no longer saw himself as the sole protector or guardian of the animals he cared for. Instead, he saw himself as a guide, a steward of the ocean who could help foster an environment where animals like Finn could thrive without being controlled. His role was not to tame nature, but to protect it, to work alongside it, not against it. Over time, Jonah's heart began to heal. He found peace in the knowledge that Finn had survived, even if it wasn't in the way Jonah had hoped. The shark had swum away, back into the deep, free to live its life as nature intended. It was a bittersweet thought, but one that gave Jonah a sense of closure. Finn had made the choice to return to the wild, and Jonah had to accept that decision, no matter how painful it was. His role had always been to give Finn a chance, not to hold him captive. One afternoon, while walking along the shoreline, Jonah encountered a group of local fishermen who had spotted a large shark in the area. It wasn't Finn, but Jonah couldn't help but smile. The shark was a reminder of the ocean's power, a reminder of the creatures that lived within it, free from the constraints of human hands. Jonah waved to the fishermen, who were busy with their nets, but he knew deep down that he had found a new purpose. He would continue to protect the ocean, to care for its creatures, but he would no longer make the mistake of believing that he could control them. The ocean was its own entity, its creatures wild and free. As the days turned into weeks, Jonah found himself more in tune with the rhythm of the ocean. He no longer feared it, nor did he feel the need to dominate it. He had learned to listen to the waves, to respect their power and unpredictability. The wildness that once seemed so daunting had become a part of him, and he felt a deeper connection to the earth and its creatures than ever before. In the end, Jonah knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had learned to love and respect nature, but more importantly, he had learned to let go. It was a painful lesson, but one that had shaped him into a wiser, more compassionate person. The shark he had raised had given him that gift, and for that, Jonah would always be grateful. Jonah stood at the edge of the beach, watching the waves roll in once again, and for the first time since Finn's departure, he felt a sense of peace. The ocean was vast and untamed, but so was he. And together, they would continue to grow, each in their own way, without the need to control the other. And in that moment, Jonah understood that sometimes the most powerful act of love is letting go. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.